we'll just do a bunch of false starts so we can edit it out and pick the best one.
This is the best one.
Yeah, laugh really hard, pretend like I said something really funny.
Oh, Paul, you're so funny. Okay, well, on that note, let's get this podcast started.
All right, we're rolling. Nice. Well,
cool, dude.
Yeah, it's good to be here again.
Yeah.
I'm thoroughly enjoying myself every time.
Me too, dude.
Look forward to Mondays now.
I know. Yeah. Monday mornings are a good day.
Right? So I think you should go first because mine's just an esoteric mess.
Yours is sketchy? Okay.
It's sketchy. And it might take all of today, the rest of today. I don't know.
Oh, wow. Okay. I mean, I don't think mine's going to take too long, but I do find this topic really interesting. So I'm still on the Belize kick right now. Nice. You know, I got back from Belize. I was into the Mayan culture a little bit, but I had another takeaway from going to Belize. And I didn't have to go to Belize to like pick up on this in life.
To be inspired.
I could have been inspired from this anywhere, but somehow it just seemed like it was in my face when I was in Belize. And that's the idea of an ecosystem. I know it's one of those things you learn back in, I don't know, like younger, junior high school science or something like that.
All the natural sciences.
Natural sciences and geology or whatever. But it just felt like it was very easily visible when I was in Belize. You saw, you know, the sun hitting the plants. The plants were growing. Everything was green and just full of life. And then you see the birds and the bugs, they're eating at the plants, and then there's things that are eating the other, you know, creatures, and cross-pollination of the seeds moving in different places. And then you've got your bigger predators eating the smaller ones, and then there I am, a human, just eating whatever I wanted. It just was like, oh man, the freaking Lion King circle of life, you know, like here it is right in front of me. And you know, I could see it in the rainforest when I was in Belize. You could see it down in the ocean and the coral reef, the mangrove trees. That was just all over the place, and it was pretty cool. And, you know, I know that we have that up here in the North America and up in, you know, Idaho. And
it's just all the deer carcasses on the side of the road.
Yeah, that's right. You know, it's
the cycle of life. You hit a deer with your car, and then the crows eat it, and then...
Pretty much, yeah. It's like pretty much goes from like, you know, the sun hitting the trees / you know, 6 months of winter, creating water flow and whatever, and the plants grow. And the deers eat the plants, and then pretty much everything kills the deer. The bears, the wolves, the cars, everything. The hunters.
Got a rough lot.
Yeah, I know. They're basically just giant rats of the forest.
Yeah. Waiting to be extinct. So I'm guessing it's probably pretty biodiverse in such a tropical place.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of diversity. You see a lot of different birds, a lot of different insects, tons of different fish in the ocean. And I think it's just interesting thinking of an ecosystem about how the entire world is basically broken up into these like segments of ecosystems that kind of blend over into each other, you know, these like different biomes of like the desert ecosystem versus the forest, the deciduous forests and the jungles and the oceans. And it's just interesting how there's kind of these different types of ecosystems all over the place. And then in the middle of that, you like dump humans all over the place. And I don't know exactly the details of how we change ecosystems, make them probably worse for the most part, but I don't know. Maybe there's ways that we make them better, but we change them, you know.
Must not have heard about the chemical spill recently.
Oh, was there a recent chemical spill? I didn't know about that.
Yeah, in Ohio, like a train went off the rails carrying this like super deadly stuff. And it started leaking, and then they did a controlled burn of it.
Oh my gosh!
Like a pillar of doomsday smoke over this town. And then, like all this acid rain, and people like are probably just 100% likely to have cancer in the next 5 years.
Oh my gosh!
Then, they only evacuated like a mile away from this burn.
Wow!
As they just burned like a whole train worth of chemicals.
Wow,
so,
that's depressing.
Look up some pictures. It's gnarly. Just like these like black clouds that aren't clouds.
Like
hydrochloric acid.
Oh,
but yeah,
Yeah, on that note,
yeah,
destroying ecosystems.
big impact, I'd say sometimes.
Yeah.
But yeah, like what's their good place in it, I guess, is what you're saying. Or
Yeah,
what's their proper
it's
place
just
in it?
it's just interesting when ecosystems are alive and thriving and working well. And I think the particularly inspiring part of that to me is just from my creationist world point of view, where I see this like complexity of the species on the planet, like not only is there complexity within every species, like just the worms of the ground are complex and unique in their own interesting way, and the birds and the beasts and everything. But then when you see how there's also like another level of complexity in how all of these creatures are working together, I mean, whether they know it or not, there's like these worms that are changing things in the soil so that the plants grow better, and then the plants are dropping seeds, and then there's birds that are carrying the seeds and they're dropping them in other places. And it's like, wow, this is an incredible master design of basically gardening / taking care of all the animals on planet Earth, making sure things don't overpopulate, making sure that things are able to adapt to their ecosystem that they live in. It's really incredible.
Yeah, like some seeds won't even be able to be processed or useful until like a certain type of animal digests them and poops them out or whatever. Or certain pine cones won't even be able to reproduce without fire. I think we've talked about that before, but yeah,
I know.
Yeah, that is wild. How, and the funny thing is, it's kind of finely tuned, or it almost seems like it's on a knife's edge balance wise, but it's also very resilient in how resistant it is to you can try to mess it up, but it somehow finds a way to adapt or bounce back really fast. So it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Huh.
Well, so one of the things that I was thinking about was back in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, you have
that's what I was going to talk about.
Oh, okay. Perfect little segue here then.
Sort of.
But you have Adam and Eve where they're basically taking care of the animals and the garden. So they're like these zookeeper gardener people, right? And I just think about how in today's mindset of like a zookeeper or a gardener, you think of it in terms of, well, you're a gardener, so you're in charge of this little garden bed in your backyard, or this, public park where there's roses or whatever the thing is, or you're a zookeeper, so you have some animals in some cages and they're like a, public attraction people can go to and see the zebras and whatever.
Yeah.
But I just think about how crazy that was for Adam, where it's like, hey, you're basically in charge of this entire ecosystem. You need to go and name all the animals, and here's all the different plants and all the different species, and you're sort of master over all of these things, And I just think about today, it's fascinating how we know so much science. We've observed all of these things. Like before, it was sort of this mystery, why do the ants all go collect food, and what do they do? It's a crazy mystery. And today, we have crazy analyzed this and made TV shows and books, and people get their PhDs in, I don't know,
in ants,
biology. I don't know, whatever.
Just ants.
What is this? A school for ants? It needs to be at least 3 times as big.
I know, because I'm an ant PhD doctorate.
Yeah. Little Zoolander quote. But I think I feel slightly torn when I see places that are just so beautiful, where all of God's creation is working together so in such unity, in sort of this untouched beauty of the land and the animals. And it just makes me think of that kind of original design of man being the gardener and the zookeeper. And it's like, gosh, how much responsibility should I personally be taking in taking care of God's garden and zoo of all the creatures, in this ecosystem that God's made? Here I am in North Idaho. Here's the ecosystem. Is there is there almost like a divine call that like you as a human need to be, taking care of these birds and beasts and taking care of the land in a certain way? Or is it like, nah, everything's fallen, sin entered the world. And so it's all just kind of whatever. The whole system's broken. There's already plastic in the ocean. So just dump more, like who cares, I don't know. I think that's part of what I feel like I've been wrestling with. And, coming out of that inspiration, it's like, well, now what am I supposed to do about it? And so I think that's the question that I'm left with. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a hard question, because like I kind of feel the same way too, but then every time I go out in like nature, I'm like,
those little worms can fend for themselves.
Yeah. Like I totally respect the process. I think it's awesome and there's infinite value in it. I don't know that everyone's called to be like a gardener necessarily. Like, and maybe that's just personal bias, but I do think that people should, in whatever capacity they can, contribute to, taking care of the earth. And like, doesn't matter who you are, like don't throw plastic in your lake, You don't need to be a gardener to do that. Like you could just be a regular Joe Schmo. So I think, yeah, like there is some level of like taking personal responsibility for your kind of your footprint on the earth and how that like plays out. And when you really kind of dive into it, it really permeates a lot of different decisions you would make on a daily basis. It's like, where are you getting unfortunately, there's not a really good way to do this, but like, it's like, where is the cobalt in your phone sourced from? Well, it's from like slave labor in Africa where they're like tearing up their countryside. It's like, dang, like that's, at least being aware is the first step, but like that's an area where it's like, okay, there's clearly some improvement we can make towards like living in harmony with the earth and even the people in the earth, to bring about a better way. And I was actually kind of thinking about this the other day where it's like, it's almost like a form of like lack of self-confidence on the part of like humanity in a sense, as a generalization, that, when you take the easy way out to maybe get some of these materials like cobalt, or, you make a phone that requires even these things, or, you have a process of doing something that requires like taking advantage of the earth or its people. You're kind of like short selling humanity in a way that like saying like almost like we're not capable or creative enough to like find an alternate solution to some of these problems, or to, meet our needs in other ways that are sustainable. So like that always kind of, that I was thinking about that the other day, and it kind of like struck me as odd. Like there's more than one way to like, probably build a phone. It's like, obviously this is the most quick and easy and dirty way to get it into the hands of everybody and do all the things the corporations want to do, but I'm sure there is more, sustainably friendly options to do things. It's just often those aren't the cheapest, most efficient ways to do things. And so it's like, because the priorities are towards like cheapest, most efficient way to do things, that's like the driving force behind a lot of business. It kind of leads to these outcomes that aren't harmonious with nature and people. And so I do think like if you kind of reorient your thinking and priorities, then your life becomes that, that partnership with the earth that was meant from the beginning, I would say. And that just kind of spills out into all areas of your life, whether you're working with plants or not. That kind of makes sense.
Yeah, no, well, it's interesting because I think about, okay, let's imagine in the future, We've died, we've gone to heaven, God made new heavens and the earth, we're on the new earth, sweet, everything's great, perfect harmony, the ecosystem is awesome, no nuclear bombs, whatever. And it's like, are we still producing trash waste, or have we like created some God ordained design of like perfect resource usage, and or are we all just like, nah, dude, we don't care about making stuff. Like, I'm just eating the apples that come out of the tree, the non-sinful apples that come out of the tree.
My poop's fertilizing the ground.
Just running around naked. Like, who cares? You know, I mean, it kind of makes me wonder if the design of how we use the earth will change, so that we are using it in such a way that is God honoring and healthy for the planet. Or will we change in such a way that we're like, we just don't need that stuff anymore. We don't need iPhones. I don't need a car. I don't need like a giant house. I don't need to like chop trees down anymore. I don't need that. So then it's like, I don't care to do those things, you know? Mm. And I don't know. I'm just theorizing. I don't know how that's all going to play out, but it makes me wonder. Oh, go ahead.
No, I think that's a perfect like question to raise, because then it's like, you know, do you need that iPhone? You know, and it's like, well, if it costs, you know, the humanity of people in Africa, or, you know, the people assembling it in China, if it costs their dignity and their, you know, whatever, then like, is it worth having? I don't know. Like, obviously we think yes, mm-hmm. But not to like criticize anybody, but like, I got a phone too, but, like at this point as a collective country or whatever, it seems like the answer is yes. Mm-hmm. So, but maybe it gets to the point where, you know, maybe we can give up some of that convenience to do things the right way.
Yeah, because, you know, that's the question that I come to for myself. If we know that living here on Earth, it's not going to be perfect, and it's all kind of a broken system, and it's always going to be a broken system, do we just throw in the towel and are like, whatever? Or do we say, you know, when it comes to human rights, we got to draw the line and protect human rights. So we're going to change certain behaviors we have in terms of how we use the earth in a certain way, or some of our lifestyle changes, you know, maybe not for the sake of like preserving the earth, but maybe it's for the sake of preserving, you know, people's lives in sweatshops or whatever the thing is. And it's kind of like, where do you draw the line on that? Like, it seems as though in a lot of first world countries, we've kind of made the usage of sweatshops almost like an acceptable sin, because we just keep buying clothes that are probably made in those shops. And it's like, well, whatever, but I want my t-shirt for like $15, you know?
Yeah. And I couldn't afford to just buy all my clothes off Etsy. It'd be like thousands of dollars.
Yeah. It's like people all kind of know that that's happening, but we sort of just ignore it and go on with stuff anyway, or the iPhones, or I'm sure there's other examples, you know? And so then it's kind of, you know, and that's an example where maybe there's abuse being done towards other people. So I think that that's one section of the thinking to consider. Okay, this is like a human rights issue versus what are the acceptable things that we kind of do against the earth and, you know, the land and the water and the air and animal life, that, okay, we kind of like messed this ecosystem up in this one place on planet Earth. We dumped a bunch of oil on it, and like a bunch of fish died, and the water became unlivable and whatever. But like, oops, we needed to get our gasoline to people so they could drive their cars. It's like, is that an acceptable thing? Like, oops, we just made a mistake. I guess who cares? Yeah. I don't know. It's like, where do we draw that line? You know?
I think, okay. I'm going to even deep dive maybe a little bit into my topic too here for a second.
Go for it.
But like, ultimately, I think everything can be integrated into harmony, because like, even when you really think about it, it's like all these chemicals, all the waste we produce, it's all just energy at the end of the day, right? Like atoms in different forms. So like, ultimately everything can be, I think, done. Like, you could even, you know, we get to the point where we can recycle Tesla batteries. and all this kind of stuff, or we can reuse things, or we can repurpose things, or, safely dispose of things into like more base elements, all that kind of stuff. The problem comes, okay, so this is going all again back to the garden, where oh my gosh, I feel like I need an hour lead up just to get to this. But so basically, when Eve takes the apple, right? It's it's this presumption of, in some sense, like biting off more than you can chew. And there's like, you'll kind of hear people say, that like the knowledge of good and evil was something that was like for people, just not for that time, right? And so you kind of get this idea that like maybe like there was something that could be integrated, but man kind of took it in its own timing rather than God's timing. And so I think with technology, a lot of times, like we keep falling into that same pattern of like our reach extending past our grasp, I think that's the saying. Where, you come out with this amazing technology, but then you never take into account like the ramifications that are going to come from that. And so like you don't have a plan in place to like deal with all this plastic you just made, It's not inherently that plastic's bad or anything. It's just like you, like in the name of profit or whatever cost saving, you just rolled out this thing without any of without the maturity, without the wisdom to deal with it, without the plan in place to like actually integrate it into your society in a healthy way. And so it's like, it seems like that initial sin over and over again being repeated through technology, where, you kind of get this, and then you're left holding the bag kind of, where it's like the plastic bag, where, you now are having these backup of problems because you never dealt with like you never integrated it properly into your society. And so you just keep getting problem after problem now backing up on top of each other. And then instead of taking us even a moment pause to like deal with something or like try to integrate it in a healthy way, what is like technology doing? It's speeding up, it's creating more things that can, that are like even harder to integrate. Like, I don't think people have even fully integrated like social media into their lives. Like, I don't think that would be a bad thing at all, but people are still trying to figure out like, how does that fit in your daily life? Why am I scrolling Instagram for 15 hours a day or whatever,
Right.
What's the proper amount to use that? Like, why am I, why do I feel bad about my body after using social media? All that kind of stuff. Whereas if people like took their time to like understand it and really go about it properly, like maybe there'd be more education around like those kinds of things. Maybe, you would, just like we know overeating's a problem, like overconsumption would be just as much of like, there should be as much just awareness about like overconsumption of social media, all those kinds of things. So, yeah, that's my rant on that.
No, that's interesting. Yeah. I feel like you're right. We've only just recently caught up with some of the old technologies we created years ago. You think of the Industrial Revolution, we made factories, we learned how to streamline efficiency, make all kinds of different products, however we wanted to make them. I feel like we've only just recently learned how to do that in a way that's like, oh, this is actually a good job for people. And this is something that's like, we're going to try not to like offset tons of gases all over the planet. And how do we make sure that this factory is not like making the water dirty and all these people in this town get cancer? Like we've only just recently kind of become aware of that, started creating accountability to those places, changed the way that we do our factories. And even a lot of that regulation that we created made it so that people said, oh, it's too expensive to have this factory, we're going to take it to China, and now we just do the bad factory systems over in other countries, it's like,
or something gets banned and then they make a worse version of it that just gets around it, like a lot of the pesticides and chemicals.
Right. So it's like we learned how to improve things and then we almost just chose not to improve it, you know?
Yeah.
But now we're in this like more educated stage of like, okay, we kind of know a little bit more of how to handle things that were begun back in the Industrial Revolution. It's like here we are, you know, 100+ years later, kind of getting on top of this stuff in somewhat of a fashion. And so, yeah, it's an interesting point. Like, okay, what's the next thing we're going to create? The internet, you know, iPhones, the AI, whatever. That like, oh no, this thing has hit our technology usage, and now we've created something we can't use. Yeah, it is interesting.
Yeah, and that's like I say it's the repeating story because it's like one of those things where I think if people's values were aligned with that harmony and with the nature, like how technology played out would have looked a lot different. And it's not that any of these things are inherently bad. It's just how you integrate them and how they're used. So that's the problem, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a good rabbit hole from all the ecosystem. Oh, were you going to ask me another question?
No, I was going to expand it further on because you said you feel like people are getting a better handle on that kind of stuff. What does that kind of look like to you?
I mean, I think now we have a lot of research on the effects of things, you know, like people are researching, one of the things I've recently been interested in is dopamine levels. When you're on social media all day long, it changes the dopamine content in your brain and makes people feel more depressed. And, you know, it's interesting. We're just now I feel like today we're in the age of research. We are in the age of everybody wants to go get like a PhD and research something and then create a TED Talk and a book and all these different things. But, you know, people are researching the ecosystem, things in neuroscience, psychology, business, all kinds of different stuff. And so we're now at a place where I feel like we're at a very highly analytical culture. You know, our professions are very into analysis of things. And so we analyze
more data than ever for everything.
Yeah, we're obsessed with data, you know? And so now we can finally look at things we've done in the past and we can sit back in our armchairs in our vape rooms instead of cigars and next to our Netflix fireplaces. And we can start asking critical questions. Oh, what if we had done this thing back in history 100 years ago differently? You know, this shift in our culture all began when this one person in power changed a policy and then we started manufacturing differently, whatever the thing is, you know? And so I think that that's an interesting age that we're in, but the challenge is how do you get that critical thinking with what you're doing in the current moment? And it requires you to slow down, which to your point was, how do we slow ourselves down? You know, it's like we're going so fast with technology. It's difficult.
Yeah. Well, then the people that don't people that don't partake feel like they're left out of larger society. So, because like, you know, what are you going to do? Not have a phone? It's like, how often are you going to talk to your friends? You know, it's like every time the mail shows up with my postcard, like, yeah. And then, you know, even then there's some level of, that's like, who's to say your ink was ethically sourced, you know, it's like, it's just an endless rabbit hole there too.
Right.
So unless you're like making your own ink out of your backyard, you know, or using your kids to do it. I don't
I make this own ink out of my blood.
Yeah. Wherever you're getting it from. So yeah, I don't know. Like outside of just doing everything on your own, because you could be sure of its like pure intention. It's like, that seems rough too. I don't know. But maybe that's the way.
Yeah.
Like small communities where you can keep an eye on everything and like make sure nothing funky's going on.
Yeah, maybe. It's interesting.
Or maybe ignorance is bliss, because then you're not, if you don't know that your phone's made with rare earth minerals from Africa, then, you know, maybe you're not on the hook. Don't never look at the news, people.
Yeah.
And you'd be blameless.
Yeah. But then it's like, if you know you're purposely ignoring information, even if you don't know what the information is, it's like, does that make you guilty? Like, I'm not going to research where these things happening in the world. I know that I could research things and learn more about them, but I'm specifically not going to, because then I don't want to
everyone
feel
knows
guilty,
iPhones are made in the North Pole by happy little elves.
And those elves are not technically humans, so it's okay to use them as slave labor. Santa Claus.
Yeah, that's the next part of my topic. That's funny.
Which, by the way, Santa Claus is the most judgmental person on Earth, FYI.
Yeah,
and he's a slave master.
That's funny. We've covered like every one of my topics already. Or they're all tied together, but hit them on them independently.
Yeah, we'd better shift over to whatever it is you want to talk about, because I feel like we're already getting into it. So yeah, folks, if you want to enjoy your ecosystem while it lasts, go do some bird watching or whatever.
Yeah. And there you go. Try to integrate yourself in nature and be a part of that cycle.
Yeah.
So I need to pull up notes for this.
Oh, wow. This is intense. He's inspired so much that he's written down some notes.
All right. So this is basically called the structure of reality and conceptualization.
I thought this had to do with like the Adam and Eve in the garden or something like that.
It does, and Santa Claus, actually.
Oh, okay. All right. Wow. Whoa, this is intense.
So yeah, we can... I think we should come up with a code word. See if I just start rambling too long, you can say it and cut me off.
Code word?
Be banana. I don't know. So basically, this might just be an incoherent ramble. I don't know. I say that a lot, but this one more so than any others, I think, because I've been watching a lot of, specifically inspired by like two people. Jonathan and his brother Matteo Pajau. And so I think you read one of their books, The Language of Creation.
Yeah.
Had some thoughts about it. But I've just been listening to kind of like a series of lectures and stuff. And so I'm basically just paraphrasing a lot of what they've said and the things I found interesting from it that really got to me. But the first thing was like that Santa exists. And so there's like a super interesting talk about that where it's like, I don't even know where to dive in, but basically, what is existing and what is existence in itself, because we see something like Santa and it's like the very off the cuff response would be, if someone asked you if Santa exists, right? You would say no. Like that's obvious, right? No. And like from a purely materialistic viewpoint, like it kind of makes sense. But I don't think we really live in a fully materialistic world, obviously, right? And so you start getting into these areas of, what is existence? What is, how is that played out in the world? And these different factors that kind of lead towards how you would classify something, I guess. And so, like with Santa, it's interesting because, like, he has all the characteristics of something that exists. Like we know what he looks like, we know how he acts, we know where he lives, we know all these facts about him. It's like, there's a certain ethos that he carries. Like all the things that would classify existence kind of apply to this figure, whether there's like a physical incarnation or not. Like in every other sense of the word, like he exists, right? And so you even have like people that go to the mall and dress up as Santa, like interact with kids and stuff. And they're like embodying this principle. And when they're doing this, they're not even like they're putting their identity on the back burner and like portraying this concept and like and embodying this, like becoming a body for this entity who is Santa Claus, right?
We even have movies where we portray Santa as being real,
Yeah.
It's like, no, Santa is real. You just have to believe in him.
Like you go into the store and you see Santas like on the shelf, like that is a Santa. And so like that's a part of his body in a sense, like a physical manifestation of Santa's body, right? Because wherever his essence is where Santa is. And if it's in the physical world in that sense, it's there. Like it's like our body. It's, our consciousness is projecting onto our body in physical space. And the interesting thing, you go to the mall and, you're a kid and you go to Santa and, he asks you what you want, like you tell him what you want. But if he starts, talking about, how his car broke down and how he's, like looking for work and, like his life story about how, like my week was rough and then I had to, go pick up, some dog food from the thing, all of a sudden he's now Joe. He's not Santa anymore, like the illusion is, or the, not even illusion, but the character is broken and like the person has reemerged from this embodiment, so there's like certain things that you would know that he's not Santa as soon as he starts doing it. But then when he steps back into this persona or whatever, like he becomes Santa again, right? Like because he's talking about things that Santa would talk about or whatnot. So there's this really like, in the fundamental sense of it, like he exists as much as anything else does. Only because like we don't see like a physical like body acting in the way that we would expect like a physical person to act. Like we say it's not real, but it's real in any sense of like what real is. And so this kind of leads to like how you break down like classification of things, because it's like, how would you classify yourself? Like a
real human, a non-Santa human.
Yeah, like you're a real human. So like, what's your defining feature of being a real human?
I mean, I could go with the Rene Descartes route of I think, therefore I am. Or I could go with like my physical body, but that's tricky, especially with robotics nowadays. Like if you just have a physical movable form, does that still make you a sentient being or whatever,
Like, okay, so you have a body, right?
I've got a body, but I got a mind.
Are you your body or are you the atoms in your body?
Oh.
Like at what point are you like, are you the atoms? Are you the body? Are you the, and then even then, are you the atoms that make up, your skin? Are you the atoms that make up your liver? Are you the atoms that make up your stomach?
I don't know if I'm the atoms that make up my body, because if I am, then it's like eventually your body dies, goes in the ground, worms eat it, and then it's like, now do I become a worm? Is that reincarnation? Like, I don't know.
You're just like, yeah, get soaked up into something else.
Like now I'm a tree. Cool.
Yeah. I guess a lot of people, would become trees because we're carbon. So
yeah,
kind of makes sense.
Grass.
So yeah, so it's like, even, so if being isn't physical, like, then, you, like the very being of something isn't tied to your physical
Santa
form.
Doesn't need to be a physical form to be real.
Well, yeah, and that's kind of what I'm getting to, it's like, so if it is just, so if your being is like your thoughts or whatever, it gets kind of weird because then it's like, well, there's obviously some, so this gets to basically how does being coalesce? Because I like to think of it like the creation story, where you have kind of this void in a sense. And so out of that void, you're going to create being, right? Whether like organic conscious being or not, or whatever. You kind of have this emptiness, and then from that you need to create some sort of being, right? Like, how does that happen, right? What is what's the mechanism that just gives something consciousness, or
right?
Like some sort of, at the most basic level, distinction from everything else, or kind of an identity.
Hmm.
And so this is where like kind of the naming the animals comes in, because before like you even get to, something being alive or, what that means, or spirit, like it has to be named or like set apart from like emptiness or chaos or, whatever. Like some order has to be made out of that, like almost as a space to hold your being or your identity.
Hmm.
And so, so the way that kind of works is by almost melding together different elements from that like primordial chaos, for lack of a better word, by kind of molding these things together through attention and kind of creating a classification or a separate, kind of creating an ordered space for information. And so from that, like what you get is all this potential that when illuminated by some source will kind of form into coherence that is recognized, or like an order that's recognizable by other entities in that that are also being like illuminated and recognized as like beings, I guess. And so I think obviously God's the one that kind of orchestrates this. And so what you end up with is, out of the infinite potential, you get kind of like a top-down ordering of this chaos and this information and potential. And then God kind of gives meaning to these different, like pulls from the potential and creates these different little spheres of order and meaning. And so with that, and then so basically what happens then is from that, then we kind of arise in a sense. And so then we're able to kind of make sense of the order of things through that lens that God has set up, like he's set up the order of things and, kind of parse the information and, And so then within that, we're kind of operating, we're operating in that system, and then also kind of have our own ability to kind of put order on some of the like abstract information out there, or the potential information out there. And so that's kind of what classifying things are. It's, trying to make sense of things, trying to, almost tame the chaos or the potential and try to understand things and knowledge and being able to, like Adam naming the animals, you're taking these unnamed beings that are just completely foreign, and you're kind of giving them a name and putting them in a system and, organizing them and making sense of what was foreign before. And so it's interesting because then if that's like where meaning comes from, this is just my own ideas and beliefs, but if that's where meaning comes from and that's what it means to be a being, you kind of get into these situations where so being kind of stems from the kind of the amalgamation of information. So like, for instance, like what's the difference between a rock, a hill, and a mountain? Like they're all the same material. They're all, essentially made of the same atoms. Like the quantity is different. So at what point does a hill become a mountain? At what point is a rock a hill? It's like, but based on our own classifications, like we know instantly which one, or almost instantly if we saw one of those things, which they would be, And so there's like these class of things that exist beyond just the material, you know. And so I think that's where you kind of get into the spiritual realm, which is a lot of these complex classifications are spiritual entities in a sense, or like in charge of information, of holding the meaning of these different things together in their being, essentially. So when you see like a city, like it's always interesting in the Bible, you know, how they will say like there's an angel of a city, you know, I think in Revelation when they like talk about the angels of different cities, right? Is that correct?
I think that they talked about that in the book of Daniel.
Okay.
But I don't know if it was necessarily that there were angels over cities, but they talked about how there was like a demonic power that was like in charge. It was like the prince of a certain realm. And so an angel had to kind of like break through the powers of this demonic being to like get to Daniel to send a message to him. There was something like that. That's just my loose paraphrase of what was occurring in the book of Daniel.
Yeah, and I feel like Revelation 2, there is something when he's writing to the churches, there's something about that. But you know, there's kind of like the spirit of a place. And so I think like that spirit of a place can be the collective classification of, you know, everything contributing to that place. And so like, you know, a city might have, you know, the spirit of free trade, you know, or whatever it is. Like in the olden days, it was a lot more obvious because they'd put their god, you know, that they identified with or whatever, right in their temples. And so, you know, if it was a Greek, you know, city, this city might be dedicated to Artemis or Zeus or something. And so it was a lot easier to see like that embodiment at play. But I do think that there is, you know, like these classifications and definitions kind of fall under spiritual purview, and that, you know, like that's, you know, almost interwoven with kind of either angels or demons in a sense. You know, if they're holding together meaning at a higher level, you know, because we are artists obviously have our levels of meaning and like things that we classify or, you know, kind of define just by our own existence. But things higher than that, like we wouldn't necessarily be able to comprehend. But if there's like, you know, different beings. And so it's really, what's kind of interesting with that too, is that you kind of notice that with things like, kind of like your desires in a sense. So, I don't think I'm going to be able to paraphrase this very well, but in the, you know, so for your desires, they're kind of these immaterial things that, that you experience. And so, you know, take hunger, for instance, you know, it can be expressed, it's a natural desire, and it can be expressed very, like integrated fine. And this is kind of like what I was saying, the harmony thing, when we were talking about like nature and, you know, how do you fit in the ecosystem? Like hunger is a natural thing. It can be integrated properly. And so when you have like the proper orientation, if you're looking at that, at God being like kind of the author or the director of organizing life and organizing the patterns of information out of chaos and potential, then when you're in alignment with that pattern, then that's when things are properly integrated into your life. So you take hunger, for instance, when it's properly integrated, it becomes this tool for nourishment for all these other things. When it's not integrated properly, it's kind of a form of possession almost, you know, it's like this, you know, lust for food and like hunger and you know, consuming and gluttony and eating when you're not hungry necessarily, you know, but it's, you just want the food, you're craving it. And so it's like this desire that takes you over. And what's interesting is that it's a force, if you will, that many people can feel, like or like gluttony, you know, it's like it's something many people can experience. and it like almost has the same source, which is weird. You'd think it'd be like a little bit different for every person, but there's like the same spirit kind of running gluttony, or like, behind gluttony in all these different people. It's like the same thing that's like affecting, a multitude of people. It's so interesting. So, yeah, so I think when you like integrating it properly is super important. And then like, that's why the hierarchy needs to be like, you need to like have, because it's not that like other entities and spirits don't exist. So I was kind of listening to this thing about monotheism versus polytheism, right? And it's this idea that, when Westerners think of monotheism, it's like there's one God and one like not all consuming, but one entity out there, like that's it. That's what there is. But it's not really like true necessarily, it's like even evangelical Christians who are monotheistic believe in angels and demons and all these other principalities and powers, right? So it's like, which sounds a lot like polytheism, right? Or that
True.
That kind of thing. And so it just depends on your definition, really, and classifications. But by all means, it mostly matches up more with polytheism. Like the kind of idea of monotheism, like a more accurate way is that you recognize all these other powers and, kind of entities that gather things to themselves and like and are classifiers and like, whatever. Like you recognize those things, but you recognize that there's one at the top that kind of gives meaning to everything else and is holding up the pattern that leads to holding up the pattern of the world, essentially. And so, and within that kind of creates a unity. And one of the problems with like paganism that you see a lot is that, I mean, it kind of happens in the Christian church, honestly, too, but everyone has their own little God, or there's like so many gods that you don't know which one to serve. And so your attention's kind of split. And, it's like you kind of, since there's no hierarchy, it's like, going back to the Greek states, it's like, the Spartans they had the spirit of, determination and iron will and, violence and this kind of thing. That the Athenians were the wisdom and they wanted to debate and like, have these like more nuanced conversations. And so, like their god was Athena. And so they all like kind of had these different gods they served or these spirits they served. And like those would come into conflict with each other. And so like the Greek states were always warring, because it was just like, almost their ideologies were going to head in both a spiritual sense and in a physical sense when they go slaughter each other each year, And so, and so when you don't have that hierarchy and you have that polytheistic view where each entity is just equal to the next, there's no way to integrate all these different spirits under one source, And so, because again, like the hunger thing, it's like, the spirit of wisdom and diplomacy and all this kind of stuff isn't a bad spirit, but when that becomes your leading spirit, it becomes unbalanced and you're not in your proper orientation to the spirit that falls under, and you might need that more discipline and that iron will and, maybe even violence from time to time, who knows, or like whatever that means, harnessing that intensity. So it's like, you can't just have one or the other. And that's kind of the problem when you're like, don't have one source, like the monotheistic source, arbitrating between all these different powers at every different level. So,
okay, let me interject here. I know, because I want to make sure I don't get lost in all the things that have been going on here, which, by the way, I was thinking about if we had a safe word, it should really be bite off more than you can chew. So you started off with the idea of existence. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe Santa is real because we've like made him real,
No, he is real.
Like, yeah, like he is
Well, yeah,
real.
we made him real, yeah.
We made him real, right? We
Mm-hmm.
created Santa. And so Santa Claus is real because of that, whether there's like a physical form, but like the idea of Santa, it's interesting. And then you're getting into almost like this ecosystem of the spiritual world where you're talking about how there's kind of this hierarchy and all these different spiritual beings and things like that. Did you have a connector between the idea of existence and the spiritual beings that you were talking about? I can't remember where we segued over from the existence into monotheism, polytheism.
Yeah. So, I mean, well, the connection is mostly just on the conceptual level of, so Santa being real, because we were talking about kind of like, you're obviously not your body, right? Your physical form. We kind of decided that early on.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're not your physical form, then like in that sense, Santa is just as real as anything else. If it's just purely like a binding together of certain attributes. And if that's what makes up you too, it's like your body is part of you. Like your physical manifestation is a part of you. It's not the only part, because you would say like your body is part of you. You'd say your mind is part of you. You would say, if you saw a picture of yourself on the internet, you would say that's me. It's like, that's just electrons, mm-hmm. And it's not even in the same realm as you. It's like someone in Africa could see your picture on Facebook and say, hey, that's Brandon, if they knew you,
mm-hmm.
So it's like, you're not even present there. You're not even, but your identity is still there somehow. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it doesn't make like you exist just as much. So, and you have like ways of projecting your identity out into the world far beyond even maybe what you realize. So in that sense, like given the various different ways of existing and having identity, the kind of the correlation to the spiritual ecosystem is that these entities exist much in the same way that like Santa Claus exists, or so that like their existence is based on the concepts that they combine within themselves. So like, the case of Athena being the patron goddess of wisdom or whatever, and stuff. It's like, or maybe there's, the demon of envy or something, it's like, like there's obviously envy in the world, right? And it's like that exists, and it's almost like a law of nature that we discovered, or something, like it's this thing that exists, this spiritual, there's like spiritual force that exists, and people kind of interact with it in a sense. And so like it exists, and obviously there's probably not like a physical manifestation of envy, but it's a spiritual principle and force that everybody interacts with and embodies from time to time that, like exists in the way that Santa exists. And so we, if you're living it out, if you're acting it out in the world, you're the physical manifestation of envy. And it's almost like, it's not wearing you, but, in a sense, it's possessing you in that moment.
That's an interesting thought when it comes to how God sort of labels people with identifiers in the Bible. This person's a sinner, this person's a saint. There's other identifiers that we could probably find examples of, but it's interesting because when you think about that, then it's like, oh, you basically took this immaterial concept and put that into your identity and and created the identity within yourself, or God put it upon you to have this identity of God's likeness, the image of God in you, whatever it is, sin, envy was like embodied within you, and that became part of your identity. That's a really interesting thing to think about. There's a lot to turn around with that, which is interesting. I do want to say,
that's why it gets good.
Oh, I was going to say also, I feel like when I listen to you monologue and you use a lot of really big words, you sound a lot like Jordan Peterson. And I was also going to say, you just need to like look off into the distance and do more like, I don't know, more flailing around or something. I was also going to say,
it's not obvious that.
Just string a line of like really big words one after another in a run-on sentence, and that's
I'm just parroting words I've heard, so I don't even know what they mean.
I just am reading off of this list of Wikipedia big words I could find. The other thing I was going to say is that it sounds like you're almost making an argument that we can create life in a way. It's like if we can create Santa by just sort of imagining this thing, then what other things have we created? And I think that gets really interesting when you tie that in with the idea of writing fiction, because then it's like J.R.R. Tolkien made Middle Earth, and we have movies about it, and we have Legos about it, and we have, all these different things. Legos certifies it as real. We have all these different things that basically quantify Lord of the Rings. So it's like, is Lord of the Rings real then? If we talk about it and have names and there's characters and images and all these things. And I think that concept makes fiction a lot more fun.
Yeah. Well, but here's the tricky thing. It's like, did Lord of the Rings always exist? And then it's almost like the multiverse thing, It's like
and Tolkien just discovered it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that's kind of what I'm getting at is that. Okay. Well, there's a few different things. So the first being like, the first being like, the potential is always out there. Like this person just stumbled upon it, and kind of like the spirit of Lord of the Rings was always out there, or some of these like fundamental truths were always out there, and then like someone kind of like math, someone came along and put some numbers to it and then made it a thing, so is that.
They didn't create math, they discovered math. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's like, is Middle Earth discovered maybe, through whatever. I tend to think there's more direct intervention. And then I guess there's another option, which is like J.R.R. Tolkien just came up with it in his own mind. And not to discredit him, but I don't think that's the case. Then I think what I like is the third option where there's kind of a divine inspiration where people that are properly aligned in that hierarchy of meaning, let's say, they're tuned in to how things work. They're tuned into God in such a way that like their subconscious is open to ideas and open to stuff, and then basically they're just getting almost like a direct download from God.
And that happens through shrooms? No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, and pipe weed.
Old Toby.
So, yeah. So I think that's tends to be how I see more transformative creative work, is them kind of like opening the channel between them and God, opening the pipeline and having like stuff flow. And then, because like maybe you've experienced this. Have you ever like been in the flow so much you like write a bunch of cool stuff and then you go back and look at it and you're like, this wasn't even me. Like where did this come from? Kind of thing.
Yeah, I know what you mean. There's like a stream of thought that's just like, oh man, I've got like this idea, and I don't even have enough time to like write it all down. I gotta like get it out of my brain right now. It's crazy. And it feels like a weird little window of time where you're like super inspired. You write a ton of stuff down, and then it's like, oh, now I feel like it's gone. Like I lost it. Where did it go? And then
like a download of information.
Yeah.
And it's like you didn't conjure that state necessarily. You you weren't like consciously like, okay, I need to think of another thing. I need to think of another thing. It was like being almost pushed on you in a sense. You just have to like open the floodgates and like let it out. So I do think that's kind of where a lot of that stuff comes from.
That's interesting.
Yeah. But anyway, going with you mentioned something about, basically what was it about biting off more than you can chew?
Well, that was something that you had mentioned earlier. Well, first of all, biting up more than you can chew could be the safe word of the monologue, but also Adam and Eve, where Eve bit the apple and she bit off more than she could chew and like opened up this knowledge thing that she couldn't handle. But that was the origin of that phrase in this conversation.
Yeah. Because there was something else where it was like, integration. We were talking about integrating something. Or I guess, even integrating properly, like going back to that, these principles into your life, like, with Athena and like, Sparta, for instance, using these like two principles or spirits, it's like when they're integrated properly in your life, it makes for a properly oriented life. And, you see that with like just even more obvious things and relatable things like work-life balance or, what's my ratio of spending time with my family versus, doing my own creative endeavors. You're always trying to balance these different spirits and like, and principles. And so, like with Eve, the thing is like, it's like going back to the presumption of getting ahead of yourself. And, in this case, that wasn't proper integration, taking that apple. Like that was the either improper order or whatever it was. It wasn't the integration that was like appropriate for that time. And so you've kind of almost made a deal with the devil or something. You've integrated this part of yourself that's not supposed to be there yet. And so it was kind of like this leap of like trying to jumpstart. But anyway, so like that's kind of where I was drawing the apple correlation.
Yeah, it is interesting. Yeah, into integration, just the execution of a system can be the flaw. It's like learning is learning a bad thing? No, but the way that you learned something could have been the wrong way, or what you did with the knowledge when you had it, you weren't taught, because knowledge is power. So it's like, if you just give people a ton of power, but you don't teach them how to safeguard it, how to use it, you've got to put the safety on your gun when you're done, things like that. Then it's like, I have all this knowledge, pow, 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 and you just destroyed a bunch of stuff, So there I go mixing the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and power and learning with guns.
Control.
Yeah, gun control. Anyway.
Yeah. So then the last part of this that was kind of super interesting to me, and it takes a longer talk to fully stitch it together with my previous thoughts.
Okay.
But it does have to do with Adam and Eve and kind of like you said with the naming. But one thing I heard that was really cool was that so you kind of have Adam as the I guess like he's kind of like the symbol of something that like organizes the earth and puts labels on things and puts things into their proper places and like kind of holds order and structure. And then you kind of have this play with Eve where she comes in and like the first thing that happens is like Adam goes to sleep, right? And it's this like funny play on death where like sleep is like a mini form of death, so it's like he does all this work and then he's like ordering the earth and then all of a sudden he gets like knocked out unconscious, and it's like his and when you're unconscious you can't label things, you can't organize things, you can't do your put put the world into whatever. You're like in dream state. You're in like this fluid state of, ambiguity. And so it's like the complete opposite of what he's been doing up until that point, which is kind of like, I don't know if not a joke, but it is funny and ironic. And so, then he has this person like made from him that becomes, his, like the conventional thing that everyone thinks is like helper, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the way it's actually translated is like basically adversarial help. So it's like, this person created is like your adversary in some way, but like to help you. And so, yeah, and then you get this like weird play where, Eve is talking to the snake, and kind of what I was listening to is like, the kind of an interpretation is that Eve's role is to listen to, or like to pay attention to the marginalized parts of the world, so she like talks to the serpent, and like the idea is like the serpent has been like miscategorized, or something, and it's like it's not happy with its like label that Adam has given it. And so hey,
wait, I can't hear you. I think you bumped your microphone. Did something. Did you turn your mic off when you bumped it? Oh, now I can hear it. Now I can hear you. All right. Momentary delay.
I think I turned on the monitoring function.
Oh, okay.
But like, so her sin wasn't talking to the serpent in the first place. It was, basically it says she was tricked. And so, but anyway, that's a whole other topic. But basically, her kind of role in that paradigm is to basically, like, if you think of, is to kind of like ask the questions, or to be like the riddle giver, or like the more mysterious side of things, like the feminine side. And so, I'm not going to do it justice, but basically that, like in a properly functioning, because it boils down to like, all these dichotomies of, conservative, Republican, male, female, left and right, and all this kind of stuff.
Yang, the sun and the moon.
Yeah, kind of that kind of stuff. And it's, so basically like the proper orientation is, oh man, there's just so much to unpack, but kind of, the fair game that these two play is that, Eve is kind of, is there to, like Adam kind of imposes his will. Like it is like kind of a patriarchy thing, not in a bad way, but like, it, like he kind of imposes will and order on the world, but in return, he kind of overdoes it, or he becomes like too rigid in his classifications, and he becomes like, he puts the world in too much of a box, and there's too much tradition, and so it becomes like stagnant and stale. And so then Eve comes along and, finds these kind of these areas where things have gone too far and like have become stagnant, or have become like too rigid, and she like hears out the complaints of these things, and then kind of becomes a mirror to Adam for these areas. And so it gives him a chance to like reflect, and then to like, basically it's like this like almost criticalness that she brings to the table, that's actually a good thing, where it's like causes Adam to like reevaluate and to like reform his traditions and his like very rigid view of the world, And so it's like this constant dance of, he's constantly like making order out of the world and like structuring things, and she's constantly like taking feedback from that world and kind of like presenting it back to him as a question, as a riddle, And so it's like this like great balance And so like when that becomes like perverted is when, you know, like Adam doesn't take the feedback and he only like imposes order and like structure and rigidity and never changes. And, you know, when it becomes an issue for Eve is like when she basically asks riddles of Adam, you know, and questions and is critical without an answer, you know, like raises problems without like that don't have no hope of a solution, or, you know, ask these riddles that are never going to be solved, you know. And so it's super interesting how it plays out in kind of modern day politics, even, you know, where it's like you see things like the environmental crisis, you know. It's like there's this idea that, well, okay, so first and foremost, like you kind of look at it in a left-right party distribution, whatever. So like conservative and or Republican, Democrat, whatever. You know, it's like the Republicans want things to stay the same. They want to order things. They want, you know, very much like structure, tradition, all these kind of things. You know, the Democrats are concerned with like the odd man out, you know, the beaten down person, whatever, you know, as their ethos. Like obviously it doesn't play out that way and everyone's corrupt, but, you know, like as the kind of overarching spirit of these parties or whatnot. 1 second. Like those are kind of the things that they espouse, at least at the very core level, or core levels of what they're presenting. And so you see this like kind of played out in the environmental, you know, thing where it's like, you know, a lot of the left leaning people will kind of, you know, push forward this like environmental crisis and this, you know, big looming problem and threat. But there's like the problem being presented isn't one that has like a solution, you know, necessarily. It's not something that can be like, that could be acted upon, you know. It's just crying doom and like critical of like the human race and like our problem, you know, our impact on the environment and how people are just the problem. And, you know, there's no hope for a solution in that. You know, it's just like people are evil. They're ruining the earth. You know? Like that's the criticism. And that's, you know, there's this conundrum that like, you know, earth is ruined, you know, and there's no hope. And so it's like, that's an unhealthy, you know, solution to that, or like an unhealthy way of presenting that, you know, while on the conservative side, it's like, everything's fine, tradition, like we're just going to keep doing what we're doing, you know. And it's like, but the environment is actually under threat, you know, like there is all these environmental issues or whatever that need to be addressed. You can't just keep doing the same thing, you know, like you need to actually address them, you know. So it's like this weird, you know, thing where you see these archetypes that have been playing out since the beginning of time or whatever, you know, in some sense, if you see it symbolically, that are like still playing out even in this day and age. And it's like, it's really cool when you see that played out in the role it was like meant to play out or whatever, or like the way it was meant to play out. It's always, that inspires me a lot. Yeah.
That's interesting, man. Dude, that's a lot of stuff you just unpacked right there. That's crazy. That was a major download.
Yeah, I know. And it's like, so it doesn't do justice to, you know, anything. Cause like I'm trying to condense down like 8 hours of highly info packed information already into like 45 minutes. So, but I feel like I want to at least give people a kind of a taste if they think it's interesting to go check out the Pajot brothers. And yeah, even Jordan Peterson kind of delves into it to some extent, I think. But like the idea of like trying to find out what is existence is so such a rabbit hole. And for a long time, like I didn't have good outlets, or like I don't know if they just didn't exist, but I feel like now in this point in time, there is people who are like doing serious thinking about this in like a really cool way that's not just like materialistic or not just spiritual, but like trying to integrate like both those worlds in a cohesive like wholesome manner. Because one thing you think about, like, or I was thinking about today, is like in the olden days, ancient days, like people had the knowledge of like gods and stuff, right? Like they knew like about spirits and all these kinds of things. And they kind of just took it for granted. And I don't think they really like thought about it in any sort of like it just came naturally to them in a sense. Like it was just the reality you grew up with, and like you understood kind of what those things meant. Maybe like the God wasn't exactly real, just like Santa Claus isn't exactly real in that sense, but like their spirit was pervasive, or like you understood like the spirit of something, you know? And so, but like, I don't think, and then as things like switched to more analytical, we got away from that and like got better at analyzing things. But I think now there's actually like a really nice blend where we're able to take that analytical thing, like side of us, and look back at those ancient things and not just like take them for granted, but like understand them in their context of like a bigger story, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Both analytical and spiritual. So.
Gosh, that's a lot. Yeah. That's interesting to think about, but yeah, just diving into the deep nature of existence right there. Thanks for unpacking that, man. That's really cool to think about.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Well, I would say I'm going to watch this back and see if I made a fool of myself or it was even coherent, but I don't even know if I can dive into that. So
it was a lot of good rambling, and I think, we can understand a lot just by, the reflection of that. And so I think you've definitely given me food for thought. And I bet you a lot of people listening have gotten food for thought as well, and you've given them a cool resource to go dive deeper. So that's super cool to think about. Yeah.
What I always think is interesting too, is like, you can kind of have, information kind of like packed away, even if it doesn't like make sense on the surface. Like you can kind of bring things to the table that like other people seeking will like latch onto or like understand, like apart from just even like what you're saying. Sometimes like maybe you've experienced this where you're like you might be listening to a podcast and they say something like kind of innocuous that's like not super obvious, but you have like some insight in your own life and maybe like experience, and you like click with what they said, and you're like, oh yeah, like I know exactly, like I understand that on like a way deeper level than they probably meant it even, or like we're thinking about you, like you just something clicks with you and you're like, okay, that that makes sense. Like it either fits into something else I've been thinking about, or it like resonates as true to me or something. I'm guessing that's probably happened to you.
Yeah, no, I've definitely heard those kinds of things before. And I feel like that's when people are sitting in a church and they say, I felt like the pastor was preaching right to me. And it's like, well, that's because they were talking about a certain subject that it's like it was already on your mind, or it was really relevant to your life or your situation. And maybe that was a divine thing. I don't know if I believe that it was a coincidence. Like maybe that was something that God ordained that you would be there and the pastor would talk about that topic. But when it comes to conversation or listening to something on a podcast, there are things where people can indicate an emphasis of a certain topic, and without even verbalizing exactly what's going on inside of you, it almost feels like you've just created a connection with that person through something that's almost instinctual. And I think that can occur a lot. And that just gets into the idea that language and communication is beyond just the technical words being spoken. There's tone, there's body language, there's a prior understanding to the context of that person, the prior understanding of the context of your own, who you are in your life history. And so, somebody could bring up a topic and in one word, suddenly it's like, oh, you just like triggered a whole flash of a bunch of thoughts and emotions in myself that you maybe weren't even communicating. So,
yeah, I think it's like as you have more life experience, you kind of get that with more and more people, like, or especially people like who speak richly. I think, a lot of depth. So
Yeah.
Thanks for hearing me out, man.
Yeah, man.
It's
good to hear you're practicing speaking like Jordan Peterson.
If I start now, by the time I'm his age, hopefully I'll be there.
Yeah, you'll be a phenomenon across the country with really best-selling books. Seriously.
Oh, wow. There you go.
All right, now the bar is set. Go do.
I just got to learn to live in harmony with everything.
Yeah, I don't know if he's not really living in harmony with all the different political worlds right now. He's like calling a bunch of people out, so I don't know if he's the archetype of harmony.
Like tried that, been there, done that. Not for me. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for tuning in, everybody.
Yeah, people. Thanks for listening. Whew. Go take some notes. Maybe sit alone for a little while and stare at a tree and think deeply about your existence.
Watch the ants go by.
Watch the ants go by and wonder if they're at the top of the food chain or if you're at the top of the food chain.
Put one in your mouth to find out. All right, let's go before this devolves any further.
All right, that's it. Cut off the podcast. We're done.